After paying £25,000 for builders to build a shell loft conversion, it was now time to take over from them and finish the master bedroom to completion. The first thing I need to do is to insulate. I'm going to be doing the insulation in 2 phases. The first phase will be 105mm of hybris actis for the walls and 140mm of hybris actis for the ceiling. The second phase will be 25mm of PIR over the top for the walls and 50mm for the ceiling. So I've never used this kind of honeycomb foil insulation before, but apparently it's much easier to fit than PIR with zero mess. I open the pack up and flatten out one of the pieces of insulation. I then measure the width between the studs of the walls. According to the makers of the insulation, you should then cut 10mm wider than the width of the studs. I mark off with a pen and then grab my Stanley knife. I use a straight edge piece of wood to guide the knife nice and straight. The insulation should be pulled out straight before installing and should also be aware that the copper coloured side should face inside. I fit the insulation within the studs nice and tight. I'll get a second piece to overlap slightly, then cut off to size once in place. The next step is foil taping the seams and studs. This will just help reflect some of the heat back in the room. Now it's time to get the 140mm actis out and cut it down to size. Once cut, I put it into the ceiling void, making sure that there is a 50mm gap above it for ventilation from the back of the loft to the front. Now that all the actis hybris insulation is done, it's now time to move on to the PIR insulation. I'm going to use these washers and screws to attach the PIR to the studs. Once done, I foil tape over all the seams again and also at the top and bottom where the insulation meets the floor and ceiling. I lastly tape over all the washers and screws to make it airtight. For the pieces that need cutting, I simply put up in place and mark off with a saw. I then place the piece on the floor and cut with a straight edge and Stanley knife. Much like when cutting plasterboard, I bend it back and then cut along the seam. This for me works perfectly and creates almost no mess. Now I can put it in place and attach to the studs as usual. Before I do the ceiling, I need to add a batten of wood behind the steel beam so I have something for the plasterboard to attach to, as I can't attach to steel, obviously. For the ceiling PIR, I use a plasterboard support rod. If you're doing this with 2 people, it would be okay, but I'm doing this on my own. I screw in the 50mm PIR into the joist and do the usual foil taping between seams and screw holes. On the sections where it needs to be cut precisely around windows, for example, I actually leave it longer and take a knife after and cut flush to the wood. I then foil tape all of the PIR edges. Now that's the insulation phase complete, next time I'll be adding a vapour barrier to the walls and ceiling to reduce the amount of moisture that will get into the insulation and timber structure.